It is a big payday coming for Ernest Jones in Seattle. We're going to be taking a deep dive into Seattle's #1 free agent and what it might cost for John Schneider to lock him up long-term here on our latest Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, this is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you are tuning in from Olympia, Washington, or Coldwater, Michigan. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We're drawing closer to the start of the new league year, free agency less than a month away. The Seahawks have one free agent in particular that stands above the rest in terms of priorities to re-sign. But what is it going to cost to bring back Ernest Jones? We're going to dive into that. Plus, we've got a Thursday mailbag, and we'll check out how the Seahawks continue to prioritize the run game with their coaching hires on the offensive side of the football. Without further ado, let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. We're closing in on the start of free agency, Rob, and as we've talked about the Seahawks, they've got 10 unrestricted free agents that are set to hit the market coming up on March 12th, but there's no player that is bigger on that list in terms of priority to re-sign than Ernest Jones, the standout linebacker that Seattle acquired from Tennessee right before the trade deadline. And really his addition transformed this defense. The Seahawks had a top 5 scoring defense after Ernest Jones came over from the Titans. He racked up over 100 tackles again this year between the two teams he played for, had an interception against the Cardinals for the Seahawks, really delivered and was a big part of Seattle's run defense, dramatically improving from near the bottom of the league to being 16th by the end of the year, which was respectable. In those last 9 games, they were in the top 10 in rushing yards allowed per game. And the big reason why was number 13. You would think that this is a very similar situation to Leonard Williams a year ago, where the Seahawks gave up a pretty good set of compensation, including a 4th-round pick in this instance, to bring in a player. You're going to want to extend him and make that your top priority. But this is a fascinating situation for the Seahawks because Ernest Jones has never been a Pro Bowler or an All-Pro. And at the same time, he has consistently been a 100-plus tackle guy that can get to the quarterback. He can do a lot of great things against the run. He's made some plays in coverage, and he's only 25 years old. He just turned 25. So he's a really young player that really could be just entering his prime. And when you look at the contracts out there for top linebackers, you can make some compelling arguments if you're Ernest Jones camp that you belong up there in the top 3 or 4 players being paid at this position group.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what his agent's going to be arguing. It's like, look, you look at the contracts, and anybody who is watching on YouTube can see the numbers for yourself. Those of you who are not watching, and thank you to everybody watching and listening. Look, the top contract that has been awarded to any inside linebacker in today's NFL is the 5-year, $100 million deal that Roquan Smith, of course, of the Baltimore Ravens, Mike McDonald's going to know that very, very well, the deal that he got. And the fact that he is 26 years old at this point, that is in some ways a parallel, of course, to Ernest Jones. Now, as you said, Ernest Jones has never been an All-Pro, whereas Roquan Smith has been that 5 times. Fred Warner, of course, Seahawks fans are going to be very familiar with, 5-year, $95 million deal. He is also 25 years old. Tremaine Edmonds, 25 years old, signed a 4-year, $72 million deal. I think that those are all, frankly, a little bit higher than what I think that Ernest Jones should receive, because as we just talked about, all of those players have been all pros or at the minimum Pro Bowl caliber players. Ernest Jones is a terrific player. There's no question that when he came into Seattle's lineup, things changed. And everybody that has signed with the Seahawks as far as coaches, like Clint Kubiak, the offensive coordinator, of course, basically has kind of talked about the fact that he's just so excited to work with Mike Macdonald. And I think that a big reason for that is because the turnover that we have seen with Seattle's defense since that big trade for Ernest Jones. So there's no question in my mind that this is Seattle's top priority when it comes to free agency. I just think that it's going to be difficult to kind of stomach, frankly, a contract for an inside linebacker that has not yet reached the Pro Bowl or been voted an All-Pro. And when you start talking about $20 or $30 million kind of a year kind of contract, to me, that's too much. I think that we should be talking more in that $13 to $14 million range. That's still an awful lot of money for an inside linebacker, especially given the talent that Seattle has along the defensive line. I think that Seattle, frankly, has more talent along the defensive line than some of those other teams that we just mentioned. It's frankly harder for some of those inside linebackers to put up the numbers that they put up. But at the same time, given what Seattle has already given up for Ernest Jones, given how effective that he was, how critical the inside linebacker position is to Macdonald's system, I do think that this is going to wind up working itself out. But I think that we're going to be talking about a contract somewhere in that 3 or 4 year to $60 to $70 million kind of a number. And again, that's going to be one that a lot of Seahawks fans are going to be frustrated with. But I think that's just the price of doing business when you're talking about young, very talented players like Ernest Jones.
And I know for a lot of teams, Rob, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, we've really seen a pivot where most teams are not wanting to invest big money on the inside linebacker position. But you look at Baltimore, Roquan Smith, he's the highest paid linebacker in the NFL right now. The Ravens were more than happy to give him that contract. Now, they didn't pay Patrick Queen. Patrick Queen went to the Steelers in division. But Roquan Smith is the better player by a wide margin of those two. Patrick Queen's not a bad player. That's not what I'm saying. But Roquan Smith is, in my opinion, the best inside linebacker in the NFL right now. And we saw what he did when he came into Baltimore's defense, how that transformed Mike Macdonald's unit a few years ago. It dramatically improved things for the Baltimore Ravens defense. Ernest Jones is not quite that caliber of a player. At the same time, he does a lot of very similar things, and he's got the athleticism to be able to go back in coverage. He can rush as a blitzer. He's an excellent run defender. He plays with instincts, and I think the instincts makes him play faster than maybe his 40 time would suggest. Not the most blazing athlete when he was coming into the NFL, but nonetheless, this is a guy that is a playmaker. I think when you look at those highest paid linebackers, where he should probably be is right around where Patrick Queen and Matt Milano are at. When we're looking at that 13 to 14 million you were discussing, at the same time, there's a big gap there. Tremaine Edmonds with the Chicago Bears, he signed his contract for 4 years, 72 million at the age of 25, and he had only been a Pro Bowler once, and still he's only been a Pro Bowler one time. So you're talking about a player who got a ton of money that is a good player, but maybe hasn't transcended to where somebody like a Roquan Smith or a Fred Warner is at. Feels like Ernest Jones is on that same trajectory where he is just on the cusp of being one of those elite inside linebackers. And you look at the free agent class, he is, in my opinion, clearly the number one linebacker that's going to be available. So it really depends on how much he wants to hit the free agent market, what the Seahawks are going to throw at him. I could see this being a $15, $16 million a year type deal because of his age, the fact that he just turned 25 and we've seen the production, and you could make some arguments that he belonged in the discussion for Pro Bowl and All-Pro the last couple of years. It just hasn't happened. And there's been a lot of talent at that position group. So I think that there's some arguments to be made on both sides here. You can understand why the Seahawks would be hesitant to pay that price. And at the same time, if there is a team, a defensive system that warrants paying a linebacker this kind of money, we've seen what a great linebacker does for Mike Macdonald's scheme.
Yeah, no question about it. And that's, again, where I think that Seattle is up against the wall a little bit in this negotiation, just because, again, they've already made the investment in the trade. There's no question that at least everything that we've read and heard, and I presumably that you have seen yourself being in the locker room and having the sources that you have with this franchise, that Ernest Jones is basically beloved by the Seahawks. They want him back. So, of course, Ernest Jones agents know that. And I think that one of the things that's working in Seattle's favor, as you mentioned, Ernest Jones did not have the most sparkling 40-yard dash time. When you actually see him in person for an inside linebacker, he's got a relatively slim frame that suggests that perhaps that he could physically break down, especially when you play the physical nature of ball in which he plays. I think also that is working in Ernest Jones and his agent's favor is the fact that this is not a terrific linebacker class. It's okay, but it is far from being an exceptional one. And obviously the Seahawks, did a great job in finding Tyrese Knight where they did, and he was the effective player that he was. But still, this feels like if Seattle is going to hit the ground running, and that is every indication, just giving the coaches that they brought in and how much buzz is kind of building nationally about the Seahawks at this point, at least in my conversations with scouts all throughout the league, is there's a lot of talk that Seattle feels like a team that's on the rise. And so, of course, you're going to want to bring Ernest Jones back. So I agree with you. While I think that $13 to $14 million is where he should go, I think that there's a possibility that number might creep up a little bit north because, hey, it's 2025. Inflation is crazy.
Yeah, we don't know where the salary cap's going to be at just yet, but if it continues the trend we've seen in recent years, it's going to skyrocket quite a bit this offseason, and that opens the door for more money to be thrown at Ernest Jones. We shall see as we draw closer to free agency what happens with Seattle's top priority. When we come back, we've got a mailbag. We're going to open it up and tackle as many questions from you, our valued listeners, on X and Blue Sky. That'll be coming up next year on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on fourth-quarter comebacks, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, such as Steph Curry. I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. He's Rob Rang. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, and thank you as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to open up the mailbag here on our Thursday show. We've got tons of questions from you, the value 12s. We're going to start tackling those with some offensive line related questions. The first one here coming for Rob from Marsman on Blue Sky. Several first and second year offensive linemen played snaps for the Seahawks this past season. Which, if any, will be starters for the Hawks this year? Rob, I think this is an excellent question because just because they played a lot of snaps this past year, you got a new offensive coaching staff. There could be a lot of changes potentially for that group.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there could be changes across the board. Look, I'm going to make an argument here just for a moment to basically have the starters in week 18 basically be the starters in week 1 of the next upcoming season. And so that would mean that, at the center position, you're talking about Oluwatimi. While I have some reservations about his straight line speed in a more of a wide zone type of offense that we expect that Clint Kubiak is going to be bringing. John Benton as the offensive line coach. At the same time, I love the intelligence. I love the quickness and the power of Oluwatimi. And so I do think that he can be a starter for you. That said, I think I'm very high on Jalen Sindell as well. And I think that he has shown enough to possibly, and he is a better athlete, a bigger, taller man. It fits in a little bit more with what Eric McCoy, who is the center for the Saints under Kubiak, and John Benton with the Saints before. So again, I think that position is a little bit in play. And then moving over to the right guard position, I think the Satoa Laumea, his agility also makes him probably the favorite at this point, that right guard position. I think that Christian Haynes could possibly be able to play either right or left guard. Laken Tomlinson, as a free agent, as an aging player that he is, I would be surprised to see him come back. But I think that there's also a possibility. Of course, you and I did a mock draft here just a couple of days ago, Corbin, in which we both had Seattle using their first round selection on an offensive lineman. So I do think that Seattle has some young interior offensive linemen that can fit into the new system that is coming in. That said, I also think the strength of this upcoming draft class is along the line of scrimmage, both offensive and defensive linemen. I would be stunned if Seattle does not invest heavily in the draft and in free agency to boost up their guys up front.
Next question here coming from Hawkstrologer on X. What is the benefit to using a fullback as opposed to a second running back? The Seahawks have such riches at the running back position already. Why not use more two-back sets? Well, I do think they should use more two-back sets, but I think that there is a clear difference between having a more traditional fullback and, say, putting Zach Charbonnet there. And this is not taking shots at Zach Charbonnet. I think he's a really good blocking running back. However, he's not 235, 240 plus pounds. He's not going to be that guy that you want consistently going after defensive linemen or linebackers as a lead blocker. He would wear down very quickly if you did this with Zach Charbonnet consistently. If you had somebody like, say, Adam Prentice, who was the fullback for the Saints the last 4 years, including last year playing 25% of the snaps for Clint Kubiak, he's 240 to 250 pounds. I've seen him listed anywhere between there. He is built like an actual fullback. He has the girth and the muscle to be able to take on that heavy duty, and he's not a runner. Now, he's caught a few passes, but he is a blocker, and I think it creates real issues for defenses when you have a really good fullback, because you can't play two deep safety looks against teams that effectively use fullbacks. You had to get somebody else up in the box to account for that extra player that you have to deal with in the run game, and that opens things up for your play action game. So this is why I've been pushing for a fullback for a while. If you can get one that has the ability to catch and run the ball a little bit and also is a reliable, consistent blocker like a Kyle Juszczyk, that's your goal, to get somebody like that. I just don't think that Zach Charbonnet or any of the other running backs the Seahawks have, they're not going to be able to fulfill that role if you're going to be playing fullbacks 25+% of the time, like Clint Kubiak wants to do. You need somebody that can physically handle that, and I think that'd be asking too much of the running backs. Our next question here for Rob. Nashville T on Blue Sky. Looking forward to the draft. Can you list your favorite offensive lineman and wide receiver? Rob, this is like Christmas for you.
Well, in some ways. I mean, my very favorite offensive lineman actually had to the Seahawks in a previous mock draft. That's Joshua Simmons, the left tackle from the Ohio State Buccaneers. Now, Ohio State Buccaneers, excuse me. Yeah, but at the same time, to me, again, he is a guy that is absolutely spectacular talent. I mean, he's 6'5", he's 315 pounds, and he just moves so much more fluidly than what is a terrific offensive line class, at least at the tackle positions, in my opinion. I don't think that there's any question about that. He is going to wind up being an early first round selection once he gets his knee checked out. So to me, he is one of my absolute favorites. Mentioned Armand Membo. That's who I had in the last mock draft for the Seahawks. You, I believe, had Tyler Booker, the interior offensive lineman from Alabama. I think all three of those players would be a home run selection for the Seahawks. In the case of Simmons, as I mentioned before, he played left tackle as well as right tackle positions. So I like that positional versatility. Membo, he is more of a right tackle that he can slide inside to guard. And then Tyler Booker, I mean, he is is just as physical and powerful and agile as it gets. The leadership that he has provided as well at Alabama, the scouts that are going through Tuscaloosa absolutely rave about him. And frankly, that's one of the things you and I have talked about before, Corbin. This is a group that, as long as Seattle's offensive lineman, that really needs somebody to kind of take over the mantle as being kind of the leader of that group. You don't want that necessarily to be a rookie, but still, it does feel like you need somebody to kind of take that spot. And so I think that Booker would make some sense in that way. When it comes to the wide receiver positions, look, I'm not as high in this wide receiver class as a lot of people seem to be. At the same time, I am a fan of some of the wide receivers. Talked about some of them, just here in recent days. Besh from TCU, to me, is one of my favorite players in this class. Ayumanor, the wide receiver from Stanford, and I always butcher his name, I apologize, but he also was a terrific one. Look, I like Tet from Arizona, and I mess up his name all the time. Tet McMillan, the big play wideout that everybody seems to just be gaga about. I can tell you this, for as many 50-50 balls as the 6'5", 200-pounder makes, he also drops an awful lot of passes. And so when you really start watching his tape, to me, he is not the slam dunk top wide receiver candidate that everybody seems to think that he is. We talked a lot about Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State and a number of other guys that are so-called second-tier guys. I think that a wide receiver in this draft class that's going to be selected in the second round may actually wind up being the best wide receiver, as opposed to some of the guys that are being bandied about as those first-round kind of guys, again, like McMillan from Arizona.
Our next question, this one is coming off of X from SH Carson 2. What are your thoughts on how high nose tackle Zero Tech is as a target this offseason? Rob, we've talked about this several times in the show. I think that this is an underrated, significant need for the Seattle Seahawks because I don't think they want Byron Murphy II to be playing 80% of his snaps as a nose tackle. You want to be able to unleash him as a 3-tech or a 2-eye and really let his athleticism take over, and then you can get more pass rushing production. But Jonathan Hankins is a free agent. We'll see if he ends up coming back or not. This is a deep, deep class along the defensive line, and there's a lot of big boys. This is not a defensive line class where you've got a lot of 290 to 300 pounders. We've seen that in recent years where there's been depth, but it's been more of the athletic, smaller defensive tackles. This draft class, you got a lot of beef. There's a lot of big boys, a lot of really good players that can come in and step in and play significant snaps on day one. So I think Seattle's got a great opportunity to get that long-term option at nose tackle in this upcoming draft. But I do think on defense that is one of the bigger needs that the Seahawks have heading into this offseason. Our last question for Rob here. This one's coming from C Trainer on X. Should the Seahawks entertain trading Riq Woolen? What kind of compensation do you think they could get in return?
Well, I think that you have to kick the can around a little bit and at least explore the possibility. The fact that he was, of course, benched this past season for a game, I think shows that the Seattle loves the talent. I think anybody who watches and can see the talent, but unless that he is going to remain very consistent, I believe that the term that Mike McDonald used was locked in. Again, if you're not a player who is 100% locked into this system, then perhaps he might be somebody who would be looking to leave in free agency in a couple of more years anyways. So again, I do think that that's something that you can at least explore. I think the highest you're going to get for Riq Woolen, as talented as I think he is probably a second-round pick. And for the reasons that I just talked about, again, some questions about whether he's locked in, some questions about whether he is the best run-supporting cornerback, some question, the fact that this is a very good cornerback class. You were 100% right, Corbin. Defensive tackle is terrific. Running back is also very good. Cornerback is right there with them, in my opinion, as far as the real strength of 2025 draft class. To me, those are reasons why I don't think that you are going to necessarily get as much as you'd like to think that you could get for a player who is the athletic phenomenon that is Riq Woolen. So I think that the most likely scenario is that he remains with the Seahawks, and then hopefully he balls out this upcoming season, forces Seattle hand to extend him rather than looking to trade the dynamic cornerback.
Putting a bow on our Thursday mailbag, Roger Vanu on X. Kubiak was very clear about the importance of an elite center in his system. Do the Hawks sign a free agent center? And if so, Are there any available, or do they draft a center? And if so, who? Obviously, I'm not going to rule out the possibility of Seattle drafting a center. It absolutely could happen. However, I do think the comments that Clint Kubiak made, maybe you take it with a grain of salt, but the center position is incredibly important when you are talking about a zone-heavy scheme, particularly one with wide zones. And center is a position the Seahawks have been looking for a long-term answer for what feels like 50 years. I know it's been a decade, but it feels like it's been longer. It's been a long time since they've had continuity and they've been able to have a multi-year starter. Maybe Oluwatimi's still that guy, but I'm going to throw this name out there. As soon as those comments were made by Kubiak on Tuesday, and that was in one of his radio interviews after we talked to him during his introductory press conference, Drew Dahlman of the Atlanta Falcons, who is a free agent, previously played at Stanford, is not the biggest guy. But, Rob, we talked about him going in the pre-draft process 4 years ago when we were doing this show. And Drew Dahlman is incredibly intelligent. Coming from Stanford, he is as smart of a player as you're going to see, and he is agile. He moves well. I think you couple those things in the fact that he's been one of the rising young centers in the league the last 4 years. Maybe that's where John Schneider spends his money on the offensive line. Instead of splurging on a guard, if center indeed is the position you need an elite player in the system, according to the play caller, Drew Dahlman could be the guy that the Seahawks end up going for on a long-term contract and spending some money to finally solidify the center position long-term. We'll see what ends up happening on that front. But reading into that comment, I don't know necessarily that that was a great endorsement, the way that question was answered for Oluwatimi. We'll see. Maybe it's different. But I think Drew Dahlman is the name to keep a very close eye on with free agency set to start in less than a month. When we come back, we are going to take a look at the latest coaching hire for the Seahawks and, in general, how it continues to emphasize one aspect the Seahawks want to get better at this upcoming season. We'll get to that up next here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Football season may be over, but basketball is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you pick more or less on at least 2-player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. This week, I'm looking at Jimmy Butler for more than 20 points for the Warriors. The best part, PrizePicks is quick and easy. You can set up your lineup in less than 60 seconds, and their fast and secure withdrawals mean I get my winnings in as little as 15 minutes. Plus, I love their weekly promos like Taco Tuesday, where you get discounted player projections for even better value. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's the code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And don't forget to tune in to the Locked On NFL podcast now twice a day. Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans with your morning cup of NFL Espresso. And Tony Wiggins, our buddy from Locked On Jaguars, bringing the humor and the insight. That's Locked On NFL now twice a day. Subscribe on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast. Make it your second listen after listening to Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks continue to overhaul their offensive staff, and part of the theme has been familiarity. And I like how Clint Kubiak put it on Tuesday, that he's excited to have some coaches that he has some connections with, and at the same time, be able to pick up on some new ideas from some of the coaches he hasn't worked with before that have been retained, like, say, tight end coach Mac Brown. But he continues to bring in coaches that he has prior ties with. We've already seen John Benton, the offensive line coach, Andrew Janocko, the quarterback coach, and now he has hired a run game coordinator, which the Seahawks did not have one last year, which that honestly stunned me. I thought for sure Ryan Grubb, with his passing background, he was going to have somebody that was going to be a run game coordinator, but they only had a pass game specialist in Jake Peetz. There was not a run game coordinator. I suppose that Kennedy Palomalu held that hat unofficially, Rob, but the opportunity to bring in Justin Outten, who coached with Kubiak in Denver in 2022. This has been one of the fast risers in the NFL. He's been the running back coach for Tennessee the last 2 years. As bad as the Titans were this past season, Tony Pollard rushed for over 1,000 yards. And late in the year, they were running the football as well as anybody. And 2 years ago, obviously, was working with Derrick Henry. The Titans were a really good run team then as well. There's a track record that speaks for itself here. He worked in Green Bay for Matt LaFleur for 3 years. So he's already got that experience working with somebody from the Shanahan coaching tree with a similar offense. This should not come as a surprise at all that Justin Outten is being brought in here to help overhaul this run game, which continues to be the emphasis of all of these moves that are being made by the Seahawks on offense.
Yeah, Corbin, to me, this is a sneaky hire. I really like this hire for the Seahawks. I think that, for one, the fact that Seattle didn't have a running game coordinator last year, I think that, hey, I often say, the proof is in the pudding. Anybody who saw Seattle's running game last year, I guess that's, maybe a reflection of the fact that they didn't have a running game coordinator, with all due respect to the previous Seahawks coaches and definitely to Kennedy Polamalu, who you and I both are big fans of, and his coaching ability. But that said, I love the familiarity of Justin Outten here with Clint Kubiak. And so I think that's the first thing. And then you mentioned the success that Tony Pollard had last year for the Tennessee Titans. I mean, the Tennessee Titans were a team that basically they deserved to have the number one overall selection in the 2025 draft, because frankly, I thought that they were the least talented team in the NFL. And the fact that Tony Pollard still ran for 1,000 yards, that they use a two-back system with Tyjae Spears, similar to the way the Seahawks are likely to be using Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet, and perhaps even K. McIntosh or George Holani, or maybe even a draft pick this year. Who knows? But still, the fact that he has shown the ability to just turn and hand the ball off, essentially, from a coach's perspective, to a superstar like a Derrick Henry, and then you don't have that much fall off when it comes to going from Derrick Henry to a Tony Pollard and a Tyjae Spears, to me, is exactly the type of production I'm looking for a coach. There's a lot of coaches that get hired because they happen to be calling plays for some of the absolute elite players in all of the NFL. I'm excited about Justin Outten and his meteoric rise from being a high school coach in Texas to basically bouncing around with 4 different NFL teams at this point. He was the offensive coordinator for a short time in Denver. He's been a running game coordinator. He's been a running game coach. He's been a tight end coach, which, as we've talked about before, that is another position of concern potentially for the Seahawks. So they can get a little bit more push from their tight ends. That could be critical. I love the fact that right from the get-go, Clint Kubiak said that he wanted a fullback. Of course, that is something that Justin Outten has worked with in the past as well. So again, to me, this is all of the indications that Seattle is going to be more physical at the point of attack. And I think that's exactly what the Seahawks look or need to do if they want to be a little bit more of a player when it comes to the playoff situation. And then again, just be on the heels of a Super Bowl, which you saw the Philadelphia Eagles basically manhandle a Chiefs team that was going for a three-peat. That to me is how you win and play football, especially as it gets cold in the winter in Seattle. To me, this is an exciting hire, one that I think that is going to help the Seahawks get some victories in the future.
Something that I love that you pointed out, that Justin Outten coached tight ends in Green Bay. And what I'm noticing, this has become a familiar trend here. There's a lot of emphasis on the offensive line with the hires that are being made here, because Justin Outten, I know it was the tight end position, but still, tight end coaches work in tandem with offensive line coaches. And you have to have a strong understanding of the run schemes when you are working with tight ends on blocking things. And then you also have the running game background, obviously coaching running backs. But Justin Outten coached tight ends. Andrew Janocko coached receivers and offensive linemen before he became a quarterback coach. So as Kubiak was talking, he's kind of got that all-encompassing background where he can really put Geno Smith in a position where he understands the whole picture with this offense, because his quarterback coach gets it. He's coached offensive linemen. And then you got John Benton with his 20-plus years coaching the offensive line. There's a lot of emphasis here. And Kennedy Polamalu returning, he's been a run game coordinator in college and the NFL. So you have a much different picture than we had last year, where you had a first-time NFL offensive coordinator. You had a first-time NFL offensive line coach. You had, other than Kennedy Palomalu, you had a lot of inexperience. Now you're talking about a group that, even though Clint Kubiak and Andrew Janocko are both under 41 years of age, and Justin Outten is a younger coach still at 42, these guys have coached more than 30 years in the NFL between the three of them. So you have a much more experienced staff this year than what you had last year. And obviously bringing Kennedy Palomalu back, a guy that's been coaching football for 30 plus years, and a lot of that in the NFL. You have gone from being a vastly inexperienced group compared to the rest of the NFC West offensive coaching staff. You have as experienced of a coaching staff now as you can have in this division, and you still have the youth factor with a number of these coaches. I think that's a really exciting development for Mike Macdonald's staff.
No question about it. And one other thing I wanted to mention real quickly here about Justin Outten is the fact that, again, it wasn't just Derrick Henry who left Tennessee a year ago. Of course, their head coach, Mike Vrabel, was let go. And the fact that Brian Callahan, who took over as head coach for Tennessee, retained Justin Outten, to me, that is a statement about how good of a coach that he was viewed by the Titans organization. And you think about, the transition from Pete Carroll to Mike Macdonald. I mean, the only coach that was retained was Carl Scott, and Seattle secondary was arguably the best positional group on the entire field. So to me, that just speaks to how highly regarded Justin Outten is by Tennessee, and kudos to the Seahawks for being able to lure him to the Pacific Northwest, because again, I do think that this is just a reinforcement of the idea that Seattle is all in on improving their offensive line and running game. And that, to me, was the biggest area of concern for this club a year ago, and why they should be are setting themselves up to make a real postseason run this upcoming year.
As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to have a double header. We've got 2 episodes coming your way. We're going to be taking a look at some free agent centers in one episode and free agent guards in another. So if you want improvements in the offensive line, we've got a menu for you tomorrow with 2 episodes. Locked On Seahawks. Make sure you're listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Go Hawks.